she arrived at Ashford Hall carrying a tray. Not as a guest, not as the daughter of Lord Ashby, who was already seated at the far end of the long dining table, laughing at something the Earl of Whitmore had said. Not as anyone worth noticing. She arrived as extra help for the evening. That was what her father had told the butler, extra help. He had not mentioned her name. He had not mentioned that she was his daughter. He never did, not when it was inconvenient. And tonight, with half of the county's finest families gathered beneath the Duke of Ashford's chandelier, Cecily was very inconvenient indeed. She wore her stepmother's old apron. Her hair was pinned back so tightly it pulled at her temples. The tray in her hands held 6 crystal glasses, and not one person in that glittering room looked up as she walked in. Not one person except the Duke. The Duke of Ashford sat at the head of his own table the way most men sat on thrones, like the room existed to frame him, and he knew it. James Wyndham, the 5th Duke of Ashford, was not a man women described as warm. They described him as striking, formidable, occasionally terrifying depending on which drawing room you were in and how recently he had dismissed someone's husband from his estate. He was 34 years old, unmarried by choice, and had never once been seen at a dinner party looking anything other than faintly bored. He was not bored tonight. He noticed her the moment she stepped through the servant's door, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the quiet, unannounced way of someone who had never been told so. He noticed her because of the way she walked, not like a housemaid. A housemaid learned early to make herself invisible, to move along the walls, to keep her eyes down, to exist in a room without disturbing it. This girl walked like someone who had been taught to enter a room differently, shoulders straight, chin level, and was now fighting every instinct in her body to remember she wasn't supposed to. James watched her set the glasses down at the far end of the table. He watched her glance just once at her father, Lord Ashby, red-faced and jovial, already on his 2nd glass of claret, and then look away. Quickly. The way you look away from something that hurts. He said nothing. He picked up his fork. The dinner continued, but he did not stop watching her. By the 3rd course, he had noticed everything he needed to notice. The apron was too large, taken from someone else, hurriedly tied. Her shoes were good, not housemaid's shoes, the kind of shoes a young woman wore to church or to a respectable afternoon visit. And her hands, when she reached across to refill Lord Pemberton's glass, did not have the roughness of someone who had spent years in service. These were not the hands of a housemaid. Across the table, Lord Ashby was telling a story about his prize horses. The guests were laughing. No one was watching the girl refilling their glasses. No one was asking who she was or why she was there. James set down his wine. In 20 years of dinners, in 20 years of watching people perform for each other across tables exactly like this one, he had seen many things. Cruelty dressed as humor. Ambition dressed as friendship. He had seen men sell their daughters' futures over a handshake before the soup course was finished. He had never seen a man send his daughter in through the servant's door. Not until tonight. He looked at the girl again. She had moved to the sideboard now, her back to the room, arranging the dessert service with the careful focus of someone determined not to cry. Something shifted in his chest. Something he didn't particularly welcome. He reached for his wine glass, brought it slowly to his lips, and made a decision. The girl with the tray had no idea that the most powerful man in the room had not taken his eyes off her for the better part of an hour. She was too busy surviving the evening. She was too busy not looking at her father. She was too busy reminding herself that this was not the worst thing he had ever done to her, only the most public. She was wrong about one thing, though. It was about to become the most important evening of her life. The dessert course came and went. The guests moved from the dining room to the drawing room in that slow, self-satisfied way of people who had eaten too much and intended to drink more. Voices rose. Someone sat down at the pianoforte. The evening had settled into itself, comfortable and predictable, the way evenings like this always did. James did not follow his guests. He stood at the window of the empty dining room, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at nothing in particular. The servants were clearing the table behind him. He heard the quiet clink of crystal, the soft footsteps, the careful efficiency of people trained not to exist too loudly. He heard her too, different from the others. Still that same rhythm, too composed, too deliberate, the walk of someone performing a role they had not been born to. He turned. She was stacking the last of the dessert plates, alone now, the other staff having carried the bulk of it back to the kitchen. She hadn't noticed him yet, or perhaps she had and was pretending otherwise. He was beginning to suspect she was very good at pretending. "You may leave those," she went still. Slowly she turned to face him, and for the first time that evening James saw her face fully, not at a distance, not in profile, not bent over a tray, directly, in the candlelight that remained. He had been right about the eyes. 12 years had not changed them. He had been 22, young enough to be arrogant, old enough to know it. He had ridden out to the eastern edge of the Ashby estate on a gray afternoon in October, a boundary dispute, something tedious involving a fence line, and on his way back, the sky had broken open without any warning whatsoever. He had found shelter under a large oak near the edge of the Ashby grounds, and there, already standing beneath it, was a girl of perhaps 10 years old, soaked through, alone, holding a book against her chest like it was the only thing worth saving. He had offered her his coat. She had looked at it, then at him, with an expression that suggested she found both mildly suspicious. "I don't want your coat," she had said. "I want the rain to stop." He had blinked. In his experience, people, especially young girls in the presence of a duke's son, did not say things like that. They curtsied. They thanked him. They became very agreeable. "I'm afraid I can't arrange that," he had said. "Then your coat doesn't solve the problem." He had stared at her for a moment. Then, despite himself, he had laughed. A real laugh, the kind that surprised him on the way out. He had held the coat over both of them until the rain eased. She had not thanked him when it stopped. She had simply tucked her book more firmly under her arm, given him one last look with those grave, unimpressed eyes, and walked away across the wet grass. He had thought about those eyes on and off for years afterward. Not romantically, he had been 22, she had been a child. But in the way you think about something that doesn't fit into any category you already have. Something that stays. He had never learned her name. He had assumed, in that vague way of the privileged, that she belonged to one of the tenant families. A farmer's daughter, perhaps. A steward's child. He had not, in 12 years, considered that she might be Lord Ashby's daughter. She was looking at him now with those same eyes. Older. Guarded in a way they hadn't been at 10, but underneath the guardedness, the same thing, that refusal to be diminished. "You were on the eastern ridge," he said. "October, 12 years ago. You were sheltering from the rain under the oak tree." Something moved across her face, fast, controlled, but he caught it. "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace," she said. She was lying. He could see that she was lying. She remembered. "You told me my coat didn't solve the problem," he said. A long pause. The candlelight flickered between them. Somewhere down the hall, the pianoforte was playing something cheerful and entirely inappropriate for this moment. "I was 10, she said finally quietly. "I didn't know who you were. And now?" She looked at him steadily. "Now I'm the extra help for the evening." She reached for the stack of plates. "If you'll excuse me, Your Grace." He should have let her go. He didn't. "What is your name?" She stopped. Her back was to him again. He watched her shoulders rise and fall with one careful breath. "Cecily," she said. "Cecily Ashby." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Ashby. He looked through the doorway toward the drawing room where Lord Ashby was currently laughing his generous, sociable laugh, surrounded by people who had no idea that his daughter was clearing his host's dinner table in a borrowed apron. James said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, "Put the plates down, Miss Ashby." She turned. "Your Grace." "Put them down." Something in his voice stopped her. Not loudness, he hadn't raised it. Something else. The particular tone of a man who has just made a decision and intends to act on it. She set the plates down. He stood there in the dying candlelight of his own dining room, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, James Wyndham felt something that was not boredom, not obligation, not the familiar cold management of a world that had always bent to his name. He felt something that inconvenienced him enormously. He felt it was wrong. He found Lord Ashby exactly where he expected to find him. Center of the drawing room, glass in hand, holding court with the comfortable ease of a man who had never once in his life considered that he might be the worst person in any given room. Lord Ashby was that particular species of English gentleman who mistook volume for charm and frequency for wit. He laughed loudly, agreed enthusiastically, and had an opinion on everything except the things that actually mattered. James stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him. Lord Ashby caught his eye and raised his glass with a wide smile. "Wyndham, magnificent dinner as always. Your cook deserves a medal, I tell you." "A word," James said. The smile didn't falter. It never did with men like Ashby. They were impervious to tone. Of course, of course." James did not move from the doorway. He simply looked at Lord Ashby with the particular expression that had, over the years, concluded business negotiations, ended friendships, and on one memorable occasion, caused a viscount to leave a party without his hat. Lord Ashby came to him. The conversation was brief. James asked, in the pleasant, uninflected voice he used when he was most serious, why Lord Ashby's daughter was serving at the table. Lord Ashby blinked, then laughed, then explained with no apparent discomfort whatsoever that Cecily was a practical girl, that she had offered to help, that it was really nothing, that young women of modest prospects did well to make themselves useful. "She offered," James repeated. "Well, a small adjustment of the glass. She understood it was expected." "By whom?" A pause. For the first time, something flickered behind Lord Ashby's eyes. Not shame, men like Ashby rarely arrived at shame. More like the mild irritation of someone whose arithmetic has been questioned. "I don't see that it's—" "Thank you," James said. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." He turned back toward the drawing room before Lord Ashby could respond. The room had reached that particular pitch of a successful evening, warm, well-fed, loosened by wine. 12 guests arranged across sofas and chairs, conversations overlapping, the pianoforte abandoned now in favor of someone's very strong opinion about the new railway proposals. James walked to the center of it. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. There was something about the way he moved through a room that preceded him, a kind of gravitational certainty, and within a few seconds conversations began to trail off. Heads turned. The railway proposals were set aside. The room waited. "I believe," James said, addressing the room at large in a tone of perfect, unhurried calm, "that I have been remiss in my introductions this evening." A few polite smiles, mild confusion. He turned toward the doorway. Cecily was there. She had been passing through the hall beyond it, another task in hand, another invisible transit through an evening that was not hers. She stopped when she saw him looking at her. Her face went carefully, completely still. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said, "may I introduce Miss Cecily Ashby, daughter of Lord Ashby of Pemmoor. She has been kind enough to spend her evening in my home." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of attention. The other kind. The airless, recalibrating quiet of a room that has just been handed information it doesn't know what to do with. 12 pairs of eyes moved to Cecily, then to Lord Ashby, then back to Cecily, taking in the apron, the pinned hair, the tray she was still holding. Lord Ashby's face had gone the color of old brick. Lady Pemberton, who missed nothing and forgave less, set down her teacup with a small, precise click. James had not finished. "Miss Ashby," he said, and now he was speaking only to her, his voice dropping just enough that it felt, somehow, like the rest of the room had ceased to exist. "I owe you an apology. You should have been seated at my table this evening, not standing beside it." Cecily did not move. He watched her absorb it, the weight of what he had just done, the irreversibility of it, the fact that every person in this room would carry this moment out of his house tonight and deposit it into the vast, efficient machinery of county gossip, where it would be processed and distributed within 48 hours to everyone who mattered. He had just made her real, in front of all of them. Her chin lifted, fractionally. That same instinct he had recognized from the oak tree, from the dining room, from every glimpse of her this evening. The refusal, bone-deep and apparently ineradicable, to be small. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, steady, clear. She did not look at her father, she didn't need to. Everyone else was looking at him. Lord Ashby laughed. Of course he did. It was reflexive, the laugh, a social mechanism. A way of suggesting that whatever had just happened was either a misunderstanding or a joke, and either way, entirely fine with him. Nobody laughed with him. Lady Pemberton picked up her teacup again. The Earl of Whitmore studied the ceiling. Two of the younger ladies exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation. The laugh died. And in the silence that followed, Lord Ashby experienced what was, for a man of his particular constitution, a genuinely unfamiliar sensation. Consequences. Later, much later, after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low and Ashford Hall had settled into its nighttime quiet, Cecily sat in the small room off the kitchen, where the extra staff had been told to wait for the carriage. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the wall. She was not thinking about the Duke. She was not thinking about the drawing room or Lady Pemberton's face or the sound of her father's laugh collapsing under the weight of 12 people's silence. She was thinking about what happened tomorrow. Because tomorrow she would go home, back to her father's house, back to her stepmother's cold, assessing eyes and her stepmother's rules and the life that had been constructed for her out of other people's convenience and her own irrelevance. The Duke had done a generous thing tonight, a striking thing. It meant nothing. Men like him made gestures, grand, expensive gestures that cost them nothing and changed nothing and evaporated by morning like frost. She had seen enough of grand gestures to know they didn't keep you warm. The door opened. She looked up. It was not a servant. It was not her father. It was the Duke. Without his evening coat now, his cravat loosened, looking, for the first time since she had walked into his house, like an actual human being rather than an architectural feature. He looked at her sitting in the servant's room with her hands folded and her chin level, and something in his expression shifted, something she couldn't name. "Your father," he said, "has accepted an invitation on your behalf. You will stay at Ashford Hall as my guest for the remainder of the month." Cecily stared at him. "He accepted," she repeated very carefully, "on my behalf." "Yes." And my own acceptance was not required, apparently, according to him. The silence between them was sharp enough to cut. "How convenient for everyone," Cecily said, "that my opinion continues to be unnecessary." James looked at her for a long moment, and then, quietly, unexpectedly, like a door opening in a wall you thought was solid. "I am asking now," he said. "I am asking you." She should have said no. Every sensible, self-preserving instinct she possessed told her to say no, to stand up, to find her father, to go home to the cold and the small indignities, and the life she knew how to survive. Instead, she looked at the Duke of Ashford standing in a servant's room in his own house, asking her something for the first time in his life with something that looked almost like uncertainty on his face. And she said nothing at all, which, as it turned out, was answer enough. Ashford Hall was not what Cecily had expected. She had expected grandeur, and grandeur was certainly there. in the high ceilings and the long galleries and the portraits of Wyndhams going back 2 centuries, each one looking down with the same expression of mild, inherited superiority. She had expected cold, and the house had that too, in the marble floors and the formal sitting rooms that felt designed for display rather than living. What she had not expected was the library. It occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, 3 rooms knocked into one at some point in the last century, floor-to-ceiling shelves on every wall, 2 fireplaces and windows that looked out over the grounds toward the lake. It smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and something she could only describe as accumulated quiet. She found it on her second morning. She stood in the doorway for a full minute before she went in. She stayed for 4 hours. Nobody came looking for her. The household had received her with the precise, professional neutrality of well-trained staff, not warmth, not coldness, simply the efficient accommodation of a new variable. She had been given a guest room on the second floor, east corridor, not the finest rooms, not the servants' quarters, somewhere in between, which felt, she thought, about right. Her father had left the morning after the dinner. He had not come to say goodbye. She had watched his carriage from the window of her room, the quick, purposeful loading of his bags, the way he climbed in without looking back at the house, as if he had completed a transaction and was moving on to the next one. She had stood at the window until the carriage disappeared through the gates. Then she had turned away and made a decision, quiet and private and entirely her own. She would not spend whatever time she had in this house diminished by what had brought her here. She would not perform gratitude. She would not perform anything. She would simply exist, on her own terms, for once. It was, she was aware, easier said than done, especially with the Duke in the same building. James Wyndham's daily life, she quickly discovered, operated on a schedule of formidable efficiency. He rose early. He rode before breakfast. He spent the mornings in his study with his estate manager, a thin, meticulous man named Holt who carried a leather folder at all times and appeared to communicate primarily through the medium of significant pauses. He took lunch alone, or occasionally with whichever business associate had made the journey from London. He rode again in the late afternoon. Dinner at 8, formal, even when it was only himself. He did not seek her out. She told herself this was fine, preferable even. On the third day, she was in the library when she heard his footsteps in the corridor outside, that particular, unhurried stride she had already learned to recognize, the sound of a man who had never in his life needed to move quickly because the world arranged itself around his pace. The footsteps slowed, stopped. She looked up from her book. He was standing in the doorway. He looked at her, then at the book, then at the general evidence of her 4-hour occupation of his library. The second book she had pulled from the shelf, the cup of tea a housemaid had brought and she had forgotten, the small, unconscious way she had tucked her feet up beneath her on the chair. "You found the library," he said. "You have Wollstonecraft," she said, "3 editions." A pause. "I'm aware of what I have." "Have you read her?" "Have you?" "Twice," Cecily said. "The second time I understood it better." Something shifted in his expression, that same thing she kept catching and couldn't name. He looked at the chair across from hers. He did not sit down, but he looked at it. "Dinner is at 8, he said. "You are expected at the table as a guest." "I know when dinner is." "I wasn't certain you did. You missed it yesterday." "I wasn't hungry yesterday." "You were in here yesterday." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. 8 o'clock, Miss Ashby," he said, and walked away. She looked back at her book. She was smiling before she could stop herself. She stopped herself. What Cecily did not know, could not have known, was that she had already been noticed by someone else entirely. His name was Edmund Farewell. He had been at James's side for 11 years. They had met at Oxford, Farewell the scholarship boy, sharp and ambitious and careful about it, and James the Duke's heir who found in Farewell's company something he rarely found anywhere, someone who spoke to him honestly, or what he believed was honesty. Farewell had become indispensable in the way that only the very clever and very patient can become indispensable. He managed correspondence. He advised on matters of estate and discretion. He knew where every body was buried, metaphorically speaking, and kept the locations to himself with perfect loyalty. James trusted him completely. This was, as it happened, a problem. Farewell had been at the dinner. He had watched the whole evening with the focused attention of a man cataloging a situation rather than experiencing it. The girl with the tray, the introduction in the drawing room, the color draining from Lord Ashby's face. He had watched James in the servants' room afterward, and he had recognized immediately what James himself had not yet fully admitted. He had spent the carriage ride home doing arithmetic. The numbers, from his perspective, did not add up to anything comfortable. The girl's name was Cecily Ashby. Her mother had been Margaret Ashby, née Voss, who had died when Cecily was 14. Margaret Voss, before her marriage, had been secretary and close confidant to the late Countess of Harwell, Edmund Farewell's aunt. The woman who had, before her death, written a letter Edmund had spent 9 years ensuring no one ever found. A letter that named names, his name among others, regarding the management of funds that had not been managed honestly, regarding a young widow's estate that had been quietly, systematically reduced while everyone looked the other way. Margaret Voss had known. She had written it down. She had told her daughter. Edmund was nearly certain she had told her daughter, or at minimum, told her where to look. Cecily Ashby in Lord Ashby's house, buried under her father's indifference, was harmless. Cecily Ashby at Ashford Hall, with James Wyndham's attention and James Wyndham's resources and James Wyndham's name behind her, was something else entirely. Edmund Farewell was not a man who left things to chance. He began carefully. A word here, a word there. The particular art of the confident aside, not accusation, never accusation, simply the soft, concerned murmur of a loyal friend sharing a small worry. "She seems comfortable making herself at home," said with a mild smile, watching Cecily cross the hall below them. "I only mention it because, well, you know how these situations can appear, from the outside." James had said nothing, but he had listened. Her father, of course, not the most reliable of men. One wonders what she's been told about this arrangement. A pause. What she expects from it, James had said. She expects nothing. She made that clear. Of course, Edmund had said pleasantly. Of course she did. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The key was not to push. The key was to plant a small seed of doubt in good soil and then walk away and let it do its work. James was not a suspicious man by nature, which meant suspicion, once introduced, tended to take root rather than be examined. Edmund planted and waited. What he had not anticipated was the library. He had not anticipated that Cecily Ashby would find the one room in Ashford Hall where James Wyndham was, occasionally, himself. He had not anticipated the dinners. The way conversation between them had begun to lose its formal edges. The evening James had laughed, actually laughed, at something she had said about his portrait gallery. He had not anticipated the afternoon walk 2 weeks in, where they had argued about something Edmund hadn't been close enough to hear and arrived back at the house still arguing, both of them flushed with cold air and apparent enjoyment. He had not anticipated speed. He adjusted. The letter, when he wrote it, took him 40 minutes. He had always had a gift for mimicry, for capturing the rhythm of a person's speech on paper, the particular cadences that made a voice recognizable. He had 11 years of James's correspondence to draw from. The letter said in James's voice the things a proud and privately contemptuous man might say about a woman he was humoring out of a passing interest. It was convincing because it was almost true. It took what James had been before the library and the arguments and the laugh and preserved it in amber. He left it where Cecily would find it. Not obviously. Obviously would have been crude. Just findable, by someone paying attention, by someone who, on some level, was already waiting for proof that hope was a mistake. She found it on a Tuesday. Edmund watched her face from across the hall when she came downstairs that afternoon. He knew immediately that she had read it. She had the look of someone who had just confirmed something they had always known, not surprised exactly, but settling, going still in a particular way. The way people go still when something they were afraid to believe turns out to be true. She did not look for James. She did not confront anyone. She simply withdrew. Back into herself. Back into the careful, minimal existence she had arrived with. Dinners became brief. The library, when she visited it, was during hours she knew he would be elsewhere. The argument stopped because she stopped arguing. The conversation, what remained of it, was pleasant and empty and told him absolutely nothing. She was protecting herself. Edmund recognized it because he had done it himself, once, a long time ago, before he had decided protection was less useful than strategy. He watched James notice the change. Watched him frown the first evening at her clipped responses. Watched him try, in his blunt, unaccustomed way, to re-engage. Watched the confusion settle into something harder when she wouldn't be re-engaged. James Wyndham was not a man accustomed to being shut out. Edmund kept his expression carefully, pleasantly neutral. "Women of her situation," he said, over brandy one evening when James had been quiet for too long, "can be unpredictable. I wouldn't take it personally." James stared into his glass. "She's leaving at the end of the week," he said, "not a question." "Probably for the best," Edmund said. He said it kindly. He always did. In the East Corridor, in the room that was not the finest and not the servants' quarters, Cecily sat by her window in the dark and held the letter she had memorized and looked out at the lake. She was not crying. She had decided, at 14, when her mother died and her father remarried within the year, that crying was a luxury she could not consistently afford. She had developed other methods. She thought instead about leaving, about what she would return to, about whether the past 4 weeks had been real or whether she had simply, foolishly, done the thing she always told herself she would never do again. She thought about a man in a servant's room asking her something for the first time with uncertainty on his face. She thought about how easily she had believed it. She put the letter in her pocket. She went to bed. She began, quietly, to prepare to go. She did not know that down the hall, the Duke of Ashford was sitting in the dark too, doing something he was entirely unpracticed at, trying to understand what he had done wrong. She had 3 days left. She had counted them with the quiet precision of someone managing a retreat, not fleeing, she told herself, never fleeing, simply concluding. The month was nearly over. Her father would send the carriage. She would get in. She would go back to the house in Pemmoor and the stepmother's cold eyes and the life that had always been waiting for her like an unlocked room she couldn't stop returning to. It was fine. It had always been fine. She was very good at fine. The morning of the first of her 3 remaining days, it rained. Not the polite, apologetic English drizzle that could be ignored with a good enough hat, the serious kind. The kind that arrived before dawn and settled in with every intention of staying through supper. By 9 o'clock the grounds were gray and indistinct beyond the windows, the lake invisible, the oak trees along the south drive reduced to dark suggestions. Cecily came down to breakfast to find the dining room empty. Not unusual, James ate early, often before she appeared. She had grown used to the evidence of him, the folded newspaper, the coffee cup not quite finished, rather than the man himself. This morning the newspaper was still open. She poured her coffee. She sat down. She did not read the newspaper. She was looking out at the rain when he walked in. He stopped when he saw her. A fractional hesitation. She had learned to read his hesitations the way you learn to read weather, small signs that preceded larger things. "You're still here," he said. "I live here until Friday," she said, temporarily. He poured his coffee. He did not leave, which meant he had come back for something other than coffee. She had learned that James Wyndham did not do anything accidentally. He sat down across from her. She kept her eyes on the rain. "You've been avoiding the library," he said. "I've read most of what interested me. You haven't read the second shelf on the north wall. You haven't touched the correspondence section, and you spent 40 minutes looking at it the first week." She looked at him then. She couldn't help it. He was watching her with that direct, undecorated attention that she had spent the last 10 days trying to convince herself was simply his default expression, applicable to everyone, meaning nothing specific. He had the infuriating quality of looking at a person as though he genuinely intended to understand them, which she had decided was dangerous and possibly deliberate. "You've been watching which shelves I look at," she said. "I notice things. That's an unsettling quality in a person." "So I've been told." The rain intensified briefly against the windows, a gust. Then it settled back into its steady, determined rhythm. "Something changed," he said. "10 days ago, I would like to know what." "Nothing changed." "Cecily." Her name in his mouth, without the miss, without the formal distance. He had done it once before, in the servants' room, and she had told herself she hadn't noticed. She noticed now. She felt it land somewhere it wasn't supposed to land. "People change," she said carefully. "Moods change, it means nothing. You are not a person whose moods change without reason. You've known me 4 weeks. I know," he said, "that you have not once in 4 weeks done anything without a reason." She looked back at the rain. Her hands were very still in her lap. She had always been able to keep her hands still. "I think," she said, "that this conversation is not one we should be having." "Why?" "Because I am leaving on Friday. Because you are," she stopped. "Because I am what?" She turned to look at him fully. This was a mistake. She knew it was a mistake, but she made it anyway. "Because you are the Duke of Ashford," she said, "and I arrived here in your servant's room, and whatever you think this has been, whatever you think the library was, and the dinners, and the—" She stopped again, reorganized. "I am not foolish enough to misunderstand my situation." Something moved through his face. Complex, fast, difficult to read. "And what," he said quietly, "do you understand your situation to be?" She held his gaze. It cost her something. "A passing interest," she said. "I understand it to be a passing interest." The word landed wrong on him. She saw it immediately, the slight recoil, quickly controlled, and then the stillness that meant he was thinking rather than responding. "Is that what you believe," he said, "or what you were told?" She went very still. "What?" "Those are your words," James said, "but they don't sound like you. You don't know what sounds like me. You told me on your second day here that my portrait gallery was a monument to inherited self-satisfaction, and offered to explain why if I had 20 minutes. A pause. You argue. You say precisely what you mean even when it's inconvenient. You do not speak in phrases like passing interest." Her heart was doing something she would have preferred it not to do. People adapt their language to their circumstances. "Where did you hear that phrase?" "I didn't hear it anywhere." "Cecily." "I read it." The words were out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it, heavier, more specific. "You read it," James said. She said nothing. "Where?" "It doesn't matter." "It matters considerably." She stood up. The chair scraped back, louder than she intended. "I think the rain is easing," she said, which was not true. The rain was doing nothing of the sort. "I have letters to write before Friday, if you'll excuse me." "Show me what you read." "There's nothing to show." "Then it should be easy to show me." She stopped. She was at the door. She had almost made it. Her hand was not quite on the frame, and she stopped because his voice had done something it hadn't done before. It had cracked, almost imperceptibly. A hairline fracture in 11 years of perfect composure. She turned. He was still seated. He had not moved. but he was looking at her with an expression she had no existing category for: stripped back, urgent, and underneath both of those things, something older. Something that looked with a startling and inconvenient clarity like the beginning of fear. Not fear of her. Fear of something being lost before he had understood what he had. "James," she said. The name came out without permission. He went very still at the sound of it. "Show me," he said again, quietly. Just that. She showed him. She had not thrown it away, she had known. Some part of her had always known that she hadn't thrown it away. She went upstairs and she came back and she set it on the table between them and she stood back and watched him read it. She watched his face. She had expected, she didn't know what she had expected. Discomfort, perhaps. The particular, managed expression of a man caught in something he would rather not explain. Men of his position had resources she didn't have, defenses she couldn't match, and she had spent 10 days bracing herself against the possibility that the letter was simply true. What she had not expected was what actually happened. He read it once. He read it again. And then something happened to his face that she had never seen happen to it before. Something cold and absolute settled over it, the way ice forms on still water, fast and total. He set the letter down. He looked up at her. "I didn't write this," he said, not defensive, not explanatory, just stated. "The way you state a fact you have no doubt about." She looked at him. "The handwriting is mine," he said it without blinking. "The handwriting is mine. I didn't write it." The rain pressed against the windows. The fire in the grate shifted and settled. "That's not possible," she said, but her voice had changed. Something in it had changed. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He picked the letter up again. He looked at it for a long moment with that new, cold expression. "But it's also not possible that I wrote it, because I know what he stopped. His jaw tightened. "Because I know what I have not said, and I know what I have not felt." The room was very quiet. Cecily sat down. Not gracefully, she simply sat because her legs made the decision before she did. "Someone wrote it," she said. "Yes." "Someone who can imitate your hand." "Yes." "Someone in this house." He looked up from the letter. His eyes met hers. "Someone," he said, "who needed you to leave." They sat with that for a moment, the specific, breathless weight of a thing falling into place. "Who knows your handwriting well enough," Cecily said slowly. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him work through it, watched the cold certainty in his face arrange itself around something, around a name he wasn't saying yet. "James." "Don't," he said. "Not yet. I need to be certain." "You already are." He looked at her sharply. "You already know," she said. "I can see that you know." He stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the gray, rain-soaked grounds, and she watched the line of his shoulders and understood that whatever he was carrying in this moment was heavier than the letter, heavier than the last 4 weeks, heavier than anything she had been a party to. "How long has he been with you?" she said quietly. A pause. 11 years, James said. The number fell into the room like a stone into water. She thought about 10 days of deliberate distance, 10 days of short answers and avoided rooms, and the careful, practiced work of not wanting something she had decided she couldn't have. She thought about a man in a servant's room asking her something with uncertainty on his face, and how she had almost let herself believe it. She thought about how close she had come to getting in the carriage on Friday, how close someone had needed her to come. She looked at the back of James Wyndham's head and felt something shift, not toward him, not yet. It was too soon and she was too careful and she had too many years of practice at not moving toward things. But away from the letter, away from what it had made her believe, away from leaving. "Friday," she said. He turned. "I'm not leaving on Friday," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The rain continued. The fire settled. Something moved across his face. Not a smile, he wasn't there yet, and neither was she. But something. The specific, quiet look of a man who has just been handed back something he thought he'd lost. "No," he said. "You're not." James did not confront Edmund that evening. This surprised Cecily when she understood it. She had expected immediacy, had expected the cold, absolute thing she had seen settle over his face in the dining room to translate directly into action, the way it would have with a lesser man, a man who led with anger rather than precision. She had expected doors opening and closing, voices raised, the swift and visible machinery of consequence. Instead, James spent the afternoon in his study, alone. She passed the door once and heard nothing, no movement, no conversation, no dictated correspondence. Just silence, which she was beginning to understand was not the absence of something happening, but the presence of something being very carefully decided. At dinner he was composed, pleasant even in the particular way of a man who has placed something dangerous in a box and locked it and put the box on a high shelf. Edmund was at the table. He dined with James several evenings a week, a habit so established it had become invisible, and Cecily sat across from him and watched him and understood, for the first time, what she was looking at. He was good. She gave him that. The concern in his face when he looked at her was warm and practiced. He asked after her plans with the solicitous interest of someone who genuinely wished her well. He was funny twice in an easy, self-deprecating way. He refilled her wine glass before she asked. She watched his hands, steady, relaxed, the hands of a man who believed himself safe. She looked at James. James was eating his soup. Edmund, James said, remind me your aunt's estate, the Harwell property. It was settled finally, wasn't it? Years ago. A beat. Almost nothing. The pause of a man shifting a very small weight from one foot to the other. Years ago, yes, Edmund said pleasantly. Dreadful business. The lawyers made a meal of it as they always do. James turned his spoon, and the funds were accounted for in the end. Accounted for and distributed, as I said, the lawyers, a light laugh. Why do you ask? No reason, James said. It came up in conversation recently. Edmund smiled. Ancient history. Yes, James said. Funny how that resurfaces. The soup course ended. The conversation moved elsewhere. Edmund's hands remained perfectly steady. Cecily said nothing. She ate her dinner. She felt the shape of what James was doing, the slow, deliberate drawing of a boundary, invisible to Edmund, obvious to her, and she thought, he is giving him tonight. One last night of not knowing. She understood in that moment something new about James Wyndham, that his coldness had never been emptiness. It had always been patience. The particular patience of a man who understood that the most complete kind of consequence was the kind the other person never saw coming. What James had done in his study that afternoon was read. He had gone to the locked drawer of his correspondence cabinet, the one that held documents he had long since reviewed and set aside, things that had arrived and been noted and filed under matters concluded. He had pulled out a folder he had not opened in 4 years, the Harwell estate settlement. He had reviewed it the first time as a formality. Edmund had managed it. Edmund had summarized it. Edmund had presented him with conclusions, and James had read the summary and signed where indicated and moved on. He had trusted the summary because he had trusted Edmund. He read the original documents now. It took him 2 hours. At the end of 2 hours, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and understood several things simultaneously. He understood that the Harwell estate had not been settled. It had been obscured. Funds had moved in ways the summary did not reflect, through accounts that appeared legitimate and dissolved afterward, into holdings that could not now be easily traced but could, by someone who knew where to look and had the resources to look there, be found. He understood that Edmund had known Margaret Voss, had known she knew, had spent 9 years ensuring that the one person who had documented the truth remained buried in her father's house, invisible, irrelevant, powerless. He understood what the letter had been, not spite, not jealousy, not even self-protection in any simple sense, erasure, the careful, patient erasure of a witness. He sat with that for a long time, then he sent for his solicitor in London. He told Cecily that evening after dinner, when Edmund had retired and the house had gone quiet. They sat in the library, her chair, his chair, the fire between them, and he told her plainly and completely, the way he had learned in the last 4 weeks, that she preferred to be told things. No management, no softening, just the facts laid out with space for her to do what she wanted with them. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My mother knew," she said. "Yes. She told me before she died. She told me there was something I should know about the Harwell accounts. I was 14. I didn't understand what she meant. I thought it was—" She stopped. "I thought it was the illness talking. She was very ill at the end." "She wasn't." "No," a breath. "No, she wasn't." The fire shifted. Outside, the rain had finally, after 2 days, stopped, and the silence it left was the particular clean silence of washed air. "She hid documents," Cecily said slowly. "She mentioned once, a long time ago, she mentioned that she had kept copies of things. I never knew where. After she died, my father cleared her room so quickly." She stopped, looked up at him. "My father," she said. "He cleared her rooms within a week. I thought it was. I thought he simply couldn't bear." "Cecily." He knew, not a question. The flat, airless arrival of a thing understood too late. He knew, and he let it. "He kept me." "I don't know how much he knew," James said carefully. "I don't know whether he understood what he was concealing or whether Edmund simply made it worth his while not to ask questions." She looked at the fire. "It amounts to the same thing," she said quietly. He didn't argue, it did. "What happens now?" she said. "My solicitor arrives Thursday. I have enough in the documents to begin a formal inquiry. With the original Harwell records and a competent barrister, Edmund will have nowhere to go. He'll know. When the solicitor arrives, he'll know something is happening." "Yes." "Will he run?" James looked at her steadily. "I have already written to 3 people who will ensure that running becomes significantly complicated." She absorbed this. "You did that this afternoon?" "After the soup course, yes." "Before you even had the documents?" "I was certain before I had the documents." She looked at him. "How?" "Because," he said, "I know what I write, and I know what I feel, and the letter contained neither." The fire, the clean silence outside, the space between their chairs, which was smaller than it had been an hour ago, though neither of them had moved. "You said," Cecily said carefully, "that you know what you feel." "I did say that." "That's an unusually direct statement for you." "I'm practicing," he said. Something turned over in her chest. She looked at her hands. "James." "Not yet," he said quietly. "Let me finish this first. Let me—" A pause. The pause of a man choosing words with the same care he had given to everything else this afternoon. "Let me do this correctly, in the right order." She understood what he meant. She understood that he was asking her to wait, not indefinitely, not in the old way, not in the way that meant she would always be waiting and he would always be too proud to arrive. Just until this was done. Until Edmund was handled and the documents were reviewed, and the thing between them wasn't standing in the shadow of something unresolved. "All right," she said. "All right. I've waited for things before." She looked up at him. "I'm quite good at it." He held her gaze. "Not for much longer," he said. Edmund came to him the next morning. James was in his study when Edmund knocked, unhurried, familiar, the knock of a man who had walked into this room 1,000 times and expected to walk in 1,000 more. He came in with his leather folder and his pleasant expression and sat down in the chair across the desk the way he always did, and James looked at him and felt, beneath the cold certainty, a complicated grief. 11 years. He set it aside. "The Harwell documents," James said. "I've been reviewing them." The pleasant expression didn't move. Edmund was extraordinary at not moving. "Oh. The original correspondence, not the summary, a beat. I see." The funds moved through 3 separate accounts between 1809 and 1811. The accounts were dissolved. The money did not go where the settlement documents indicate. Edmund was quiet. "I trusted your summary," James said. "I should not have trusted your summary. That is my failure and I own it." "James." "The letter you wrote," James said, "to Miss Ashby using my hand." The room went very still. Edmund looked at him for a long moment. The pleasant expression was still there. The persistence of it after everything was almost impressive. Then slowly it faded, not into guilt, not into remorse, into something older and more tired. The face of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. "How long have you known?" Edmund said. "The letter 2 days, the rest this morning." "You had dinner with me last night." "Yes," Edmund absorbed this. "You're a cold man, James." "I've been told." A silence. "What happens now?" Edmund said. The same word Cecily had used. The same question from a completely different position. "My solicitor arrives tomorrow. The inquiry will be formal. I would suggest," James said, "that your own solicitor be prepared." "And socially?" "Socially," James said, "you are finished. I will see to it personally. Not loudly, I don't do things loudly, as you know, but thoroughly." Edmund looked at the desk, at the folder in his hands, at 11 years of mornings in this chair. "She's nothing," he said, quietly and without particular feeling. "She was nothing before you noticed her. A letter and she'd have been gone." "Yes," James said, "that was the mistake." "What was?" "Assuming," James said, "that a person's value is determined by whether someone has noticed it." Edmund stood. He set the leather folder on the desk carefully, out of habit, in its usual place. He straightened his coat. He left without another word. James sat at his desk in the quiet and looked at the folder and thought about 11 years and what trust cost when it was misplaced and what it was worth when it wasn't. Then he stood up. He had a letter to write. Several, in fact. But first there was something else. She was in the library. Of course she was. He stood in the doorway the way he had stood there weeks ago and looked at her in the chair that had become, without either of them formally agreeing to it, her chair. She was reading. Her feet were tucked up beneath her. She had not heard him yet. He thought about a girl in the rain at 10 years old, holding a book against her chest like it was the only thing worth saving. He thought, "I have been waiting 12 years to find out her name." She looked up. He was still not a man who smiled easily. It had never come naturally to him, the open, uncomplicated smile of a man at ease in the world. But something happened to his face in the doorway of that library that the portraits of the previous 4 Dukes of Ashford, looking down from their frames with their inherited self-satisfaction, had never once managed. Something that looked, to Cecily, like arriving. "It's done," he said. She closed her book. He did not propose in the library. Cecily would think about this afterward, would think about how another man might have done exactly that, would have let the momentum of the moment carry him forward into something grand and immediate, a speech prepared or half prepared, the obvious architecture of a romantic conclusion. Another man would have walked through that doorway and said everything at once. James closed the door behind him and sat down in his chair and said, "I owe you several things." She set her book on the side table. She waited. "An apology," he said, "first." "For what specifically?" "For the dinner, for allowing your father to bring you here the way he did and not preventing it sooner. For not understanding when I invited you to stay that I was removing your ability to refuse." He paused. "I told myself it was for your benefit, it was partly for mine. I wanted you here and I used the available means to make it happen, and I did not ask you properly. I should have asked you properly." She looked at him carefully. "You did ask me, in the servants' room. After the arrangement was already made." "Yes, a bit, but you asked." "It wasn't enough." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't, but it was more than most people have given me." She held his gaze. I'm noting the apology, James, and I'm accepting it. You don't need to dismantle it further. Something in him settled. All right. What else do you owe me? He was quiet for a moment. This was the harder thing, she could see it. The way he was approaching it with the same careful, methodical attention he gave to everything that mattered, making sure the ground was solid before he put his weight on it. She had once found this quality frustrating. She understood it now as the thing it actually was. A man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that words said carelessly caused damage that outlasted the saying of them. She waited. I have not been easy, he said. To be near, I am aware of that. You have been difficult, she said. Yes. I am not naturally, he stopped, tried again. I was taught that feeling things visibly was a form of vulnerability, and vulnerability was a form of weakness, and weakness in a man of my position was something others would use. A pause. Edmund used it anyway, so the lesson was imperfect. Most lessons are. What I am trying to say, James said, with the particular expression of a man scaling something he is not sure he is equipped to scale, is that the library was not a passing interest. The dinners were not a passing interest. The arguments were not. James, I'm not finished. I know, but you don't need to list them. He looked at her. I know, she said again more quietly. I know what they were. I knew before the letter. That was why the letter worked. The fire, the books on every wall, the windows showing a sky that had cleared overnight into something pale and clean. I have been difficult to know, he said. I will likely continue to be difficult. I don't know how to be otherwise, but I would. He stopped. The word he reached for next cost him something visible, something she watched him pay without flinching. I would like to try to be known, by you specifically. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, somewhere on the grounds, a bird began to sing with the cheerful, indiscriminate optimism of something that had survived the rain. That, Cecily said, is the most complicated way anyone has ever said a simple thing. I'm practicing, he said for the second time. I know, she said. I've noticed. She did not say yes immediately. This was important to her, perhaps more important than it would have been to someone who had not spent years having decisions made around her and over her and in spite of her. She sat with it. She looked at the man across from her, difficult and proud and genuinely, effortfully trying, and she thought about it honestly and completely, the way she did everything. She thought about the library, about the arguments that had felt, from the first one, less like conflict and more like a conversation with someone who was actually listening, about the morning in the rain when he had said her name without the title, and the evening he had laughed, and the way he had looked at Edmund last night over the soup course with 11 years of trust being quietly, irrevocably withdrawn. She thought about a girl of 10 in the rain, and a young man who had held a coat over her head and laughed at something she said, and never once suggested she should have thanked him. She thought about what she was returning to if she left, what she was returning to and what she would carry away from here, and whether what she would carry was enough to build a life from. Then she thought, that is the wrong question. The right question was not what she was leaving. The right question was what she was choosing. She had not been allowed to choose very many things. She intended to choose this one properly. I have conditions, she said. He blinked. Conditions. Yes. You have, he stopped. Something crossed his face that might, in better lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. Of course you do. My mother's documents, whatever can be recovered from the Harwell inquiry, I want it acknowledged. Her name, her work, what she knew. She is owed that. Agreed, without reservation. My father, she paused. This one was harder, not because she was uncertain, but because it required her to say aloud something she had been carrying for a very long time. My father and I are finished. I will not be managed into a reconciliation for the sake of appearances or family relations or anyone's comfort. If that creates difficulties. It creates no difficulties. James. Cecily, The man sent you to serve at my table in his wife's old apron. His voice was perfectly level. There will be no managed reconciliation. I will personally ensure he has no grounds to approach you without your invitation. She looked at him. I have resources, he said simply. I intend to use them for things that matter. She was quiet for a moment. One more, she said. Name it. The library, she said, is mine. I don't mean legally, I mean when I am in it, it is mine. You may visit. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. I, James said, have visited that library every morning for 9 years. You may continue, Cecily said, by invitation. He looked at her, she looked at him. The fire crackled between them. Those are your conditions, he said. Those are my conditions. They are, he said slowly, the most irregular conditions I have ever encountered. I am, she said, an irregular person. Yes, he said, and this time it was not a smile beginning. It was a smile, complete and unguarded, the first she had seen on his face in 4 weeks and possibly longer, a smile that had clearly not been used in some time and was slightly surprised to find itself there. You are, she said yes. Not dramatically. There was no moment of swept-off feet, no single perfect instant that would have satisfied the audience of a theater. She said it the way she did most things, directly, looking at him, with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level and the full weight of her own certainty behind it. Yes, she said, with conditions. With conditions, he agreed. Don't forget them. I have, James said, an excellent memory. He went to her father 3 days later. Not to ask permission. That conversation had been had, internally, and concluded before he reached for his coat. He went as a formality, because some forms still mattered, and because he intended what he was about to do to be unambiguous and permanent and witnessed. Lord Ashby received him in his study at Pemmoor with the overbuoyant warmth of a man who has been waiting for a visit he hoped for and feared simultaneously. He offered brandy. James declined. He offered a seat. James took it. He stated his intentions regarding Cecily with the same clear, unhurried precision he had brought to the Edmund situation. He was going to marry her. The settlements would be arranged by his solicitor, and they would be generous because he chose to make them generous, not because Lord Ashby had any standing to negotiate them. Cecily would have full and independent control of her portion. Lord Ashby listened. He smiled in places he should not have smiled. He made a comment about young women and their particular natures that James allowed to pass in silence, which was a more devastating response than anything he might have said. At the end, Lord Ashby spread his hands with the expression of a man granting something magnanimously. Well, you have my blessing, of course. I didn't come for your blessing, James said. I came to inform you. He stood, buttoned his coat, and left. He did not look back at the house as the carriage pulled away. He thought, now he knows what it feels like. The solicitor's inquiry into the Harwell estate concluded 6 weeks later. Edmund Farewell resigned from 3 boards, was quietly removed from 2 others, and withdrew from London society with the speed of a man who has been comprehensively informed of his alternatives. The financial irregularities were formally documented. Margaret Voss's copies found, finally, in a box of books that Lord Ashby had stored rather than destroyed, too indolent to do the thorough job Edmund had paid him to do, were entered into the record. Her name appeared in the final documents. Margaret Voss, whose records formed the basis of this inquiry. Cecily read that line 4 times. She did not cry. She held the document for a long time and looked out the library window at the lake and felt something she did not have a precise word for, not happiness exactly and not grief, but the specific and long-delayed sensation of a debt being paid, of something that had been owed finally arriving. James, sitting in his chair across from her, did not ask what she was thinking. He had learned in the weeks since the rain-soaked morning in the dining room that there were thoughts she needed to hold before she shared them, and that the right response to her silence was simply to stay in it with her. He stayed. After a while, she looked up. "Thank you," she said. "Your mother did the work," he said. "9 years ago, she did the work. I only found the room to put it in." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, crossed the space between the chairs, and did something she had not done before. She put her hand against his face. Just briefly, just for a moment, the way you touch something you have decided to keep. He went very still. "James," she said quietly. "You may use the library without an invitation." A pause. "Generous," he said. "Don't push it," she said. There were things afterward that people said. They said the Duke of Ashford had made an unexpected match. A nobody, some said. A girl from an undistinguished family, no fortune to speak of, no connections worth mentioning. They said it wouldn't last. They said he would tire of her. They said she had managed him somehow, had caught him in a weak moment, had leveraged the peculiar circumstances of that dinner into something she had no right to. They said all of this in drawing rooms, over tea, with the comfortable authority of people who had not been in the room. What they did not say, could not say, because they had not seen it, was the way he looked at her across his own dinner table, a different dinner now, a table that was set for 2 more evenings than it had been the year before. The way she argued with him in public without softening it, and the way he argued back, and the way both of them looked when the argument reached its natural conclusion, like people who had found the exact right opponent. They did not see the library. Nobody saw the library. They did not see the morning, 3 months after the wedding, when Cecily stood at the window of the room that had been the finest guest room and was now simply the room she woke up in, and looked out at the oak trees along the South Drive, and thought about a girl of 10 standing in the rain with a book pressed against her chest. She thought, "You made it." Behind her, from the direction of the bed, came a voice. "You're thinking loudly," James said. "Come back." She turned. He was watching her with that look, the one she had first seen in the servants' room doorway, the one she had spent 4 weeks trying to categorize and eventually stopped trying. The look that meant, "I see you," specifically, entirely, without any intention of looking away. She had conditions, she had told him. She had meant every one of them. She had not mentioned this one, had not known how to put it into words, but it was perhaps the most important. Don't look away. He hadn't. She crossed the room. 1 year later. The autumn had come early to Ashford Hall, a good autumn, the kind that arrived with intention, turning the oak trees along the South Drive to copper and gold before September had finished. The lake caught the light differently in October. Cecily had noticed this her first autumn here and had not stopped noticing it. She was standing at the top of the main staircase when the carriage came through the gates. She had known it was coming. James had told her, had sat across from her in the library 3 days ago, and told her plainly, in the way he told her everything now, that Lord Ashby had written requesting a visit. That he had forwarded the letter to her, as he forwarded everything addressed to the household that concerned her, without comment or editorial, because it was hers to decide. She had held the letter for a long time. Then she had set it on the side table and gone back to her book. James had watched her do this. He had not said anything. He had turned a page. Later, much later, when the candles had burned low and the house had gone quiet, she had said, "He may come." James had looked up. "He may come," she said again, "and be received correctly. Tea, 30 minutes in the formal sitting room." "Not the library," James said. "Not the library." "Not dinner." "Not dinner," he had nodded once. "I'll be there." "You don't need to." "I'll be there," he said. "Not a management, not a rescue. Simply, I will be beside you." She had looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. The carriage stopped. She watched from the top of the stairs as Holt, meticulous, leather-folioed Holt, who had received her as extra help 14 months ago, and now inclined his head to her with the particular deference reserved for the Duchess of Ashford, opened the front door. Lord Ashby stepped out of the carriage. He was smaller than she remembered. This surprised her. The Though it shouldn't have, she had read enough, thought enough, to know that the people who loom largest in our lives rarely survive the scaling that distance provides. He was a middle-aged man in a good coat, his color a little high from the journey, his eyes moving immediately to the house, with the unconscious assessment of a man who had always measured his surroundings for what they might offer him. Then he looked up. He saw her at the top of the stairs. She watched him see her. Not in an apron, not with her hair pinned back to give her borrowed smallness. In her own clothes, in her own house, at the top of her own staircase, with the autumn light coming through the tall windows behind her and one hand resting lightly on the banister, and absolutely nothing in her posture that suggested she was waiting for his approval. His expression moved through several things in quick succession. She watched all of them. She did not help him with any of them. James appeared at her side without announcement. She heard his step, recognized it without looking, felt him arrive in the particular way she had come to know as his. Not loudly, not with performance, simply present as if he had always intended to be standing precisely here. His hand found hers on the banister. Brief. Certain. She did not look at him. She didn't need to. Below them, Lord Ashby had collected himself into something resembling his usual sociable expression. He spread his hands. He smiled the smile she had watched silence a drawing room once, a long time ago, by being confronted with what it actually was. "Cecily," he said warmly, "my dear." She let the words reach her. She let them be what they were, not the opening of a wound, not the rekindling of anything, simply sounds made by a man who had understood too late that some things, once done, alter the landscape permanently and cannot be undone by warmth or timing or a carriage through autumn gates. "Lord Ashby," she said, not father, he noted it. She watched him note it. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. A pause. He tried again, the social machinery turning, the old habits of charm and redirection. "Ashford Hall in autumn. Magnificent, isn't it? I always said this was the finest estate in the county." "Holt will show you to the sitting room," Cecily said. "We'll be down directly." Below her, Holt materialized with his customary impeccable timing. Lord Ashby looked between her and James at the hand on the banister, at the particular way James was standing, which communicated a considerable amount without saying a word, and something in him settled. Not into defeat, not into anything so honest as defeat. Into recalibration. The small, pragmatic recalibration of a man updating his assessment of what was available to him. He followed Holt. She and James stood at the top of the stairs a moment longer. The house was quiet around them, the particular inhabited quiet of a place that had been run, for years, as a monument to one man's controlled isolation, and had become, gradually and then all at once, something else entirely. Something lived in. Something with books left open and arguments half finished, and a chair in the library that everyone on staff now understood was not to be moved under any circumstances. 30 minutes, Cecily said. "I have the clock," James said. She looked at him sideways. "You don't have a clock." "I have an excellent internal sense of time." "You have never once in your life arrived somewhere at the correct." "Cecily." "Minute, you are consistently either 8 minutes early or—" "Cecily." "What?" "Are you ready?" She looked down the staircase. At the hall below, the autumn light across the marble floor, the door to the formal sitting room standing slightly open. She thought about a girl carrying a tray through that door 14 months ago. Head up, hands steady, surviving an evening that her father had constructed for his own convenience and called her duty. She thought about what it had cost her to walk into this house. She thought about what it had given her back. "Yes," she said. They went down the stairs together. The 30 minutes passed. Tea was poured. Conversation was conducted. Lord Ashby said several things and was heard without warmth. He made once a tentative approach towards something that might have become a request, something about the estate at Pemore, something about a rather tiresome financial matter, and James said, pleasantly and without inflection, "I'm sure your solicitor can advise you." and the approach was quietly, permanently closed. At the 31st minute, Holt appeared in the doorway with the silent efficiency of a man who had been watching a clock. Lord Ashby understood. He stood. He said the correct things. He moved toward the door with the momentum of a man who has learned that an exit on time is better than one that requires assistance. At the door, he turned. He looked at Cecily just for a moment, just one unmanaged, unperformed moment, the expression beneath the expression. She met his eyes. She did not offer him anything to hold. No reassurance, no signal of future warmth, no small mercy of an almost smile. She simply looked at him, steadily, as herself, the way she had looked at a young man in the rain at 10 years old with the clear-eyed, unimpressed appraisal of someone who had not yet learned she was supposed to make herself smaller. She had unlearned the smallness now. It had taken years and cost her things she was still, occasionally, counting. But she had unlearned it. He left. The door closed. The sitting room held them for a moment in its formal, gold-framed silence. The room that was not the library, the room that was for visitors and appearances and the choreography of social obligation. Cecily looked at the tea things, at the clock on the mantel, at the door. Then she looked at James. He was watching her with that look, the one she had finally, 4 months into their marriage, found the word for. Not found, recognized. It was the word for what it felt like when someone looked at you and saw not what you could be managed into or what you might provide or what role you could be assigned in the architecture of their own story. The word was simply seen. He had been looking at her that way since a dining room full of people had watched him say her name. She thought he would probably never stop. "The library," she said. "Yes," he said. They left the sitting room. They walked down the hall together, past the portraits, past the marble, past the servant's door that she had come through with a tray and a borrowed apron and the practiced, bone-deep posture of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She did not look at the servant's door. She had no reason to look at it anymore. The library was warm. 2 chairs, 2 fireplaces, the smell of old paper and wood smoke and the accumulated quiet of a room that had held, over the course of a year, more honest conversation than most people managed in a lifetime. She settled into her chair. She reached for her book. Across from her, James opened his correspondence with the focused efficiency of a man who had a great deal to do, and had organized his life to ensure he had time to do it beside someone who read Wollstonecraft and argued about portrait galleries, and had once told him, at 10 years old in the rain, that his coat didn't solve the problem. He had spent 12 years not knowing her name. He intended to spend the rest of his life learning everything else. Outside, the oak trees along the South Drive held their copper and gold against the October sky. The lake caught the light. Ashford Hall, which had been many things over 2 centuries and 1 very long year, was finally, improbably, completely, home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.